Hello, my name is James Cummer. I teach at Leon High School and Cobb Middle School, and I am going to be talking about Erik Erikson and his theory of psychosocial development. First, a little bit of background about Erik Erikson. He was born in 1902 in Frankfurt, Germany, but his family was not originally from Germany. His mother was Danish, and she was also Jewish. She moved to Frankfurt while she was pregnant with Erik and then gave birth to him there. He eventually moved to Vienna, Austria, where he studied psychoanalysis based on the recommendation of Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna. He could not stay in Austria, however. He had to flee due to the rise of the Nazis. He initially tried to move back to Denmark, but he could not stay there, so he eventually moved to the United States, where he ended up teaching at Harvard and at Yale. His main contribution to the study of psychoanalysis is he had a central theory of development which divided the life into 8 stages of conflict or tension. He focused more on how culture and social interactions shape human development as opposed to our own brain, our own ego, and our own id, like Sigmund Freud. So, a little bit more about Erikson's background. He focused primarily on identity development, and that stemmed from his own experiences in his youth. As I stated before, his mother was Jewish. He knew very little about his biological father. His biological father left the family while Erikson's mother was still pregnant with him. He only knew that his father was not Jewish and that he was Danish. Erikson's mother remarried when he was 3. The doctor claimed that he was Erikson's biological father for the early part of his life. Later, when it came out that that his stepfather was not his biological father, Erikson had withdrawals. He was very bitter about the entire situation. He suffered from additional identity crises as he was growing up. He was made fun of in Hebrew school because he looked Danish, and he was made fun of at normal grammar school because he was Jewish. So he didn't really belong in either world. That's sort of why he focused more on identity development, and it informed a lot of his research and his thoughts. Right. So Erikson had 8 stages of development, and it lasts for the entire life from birth until death. It's based around tension or conflict between 2 aspects essential to development. For example, the first stage is the conflict between basic trust versus mistrust and what causes that. Certain individuals or social groups are key towards development at each stage, and progress is determined by a success or a lack of success at each stage. Each stage serves sort of as a building block for the next, and it culminates in the final or 8th stage. Okay. So here are some key questions, and you can pause the video if you would like and discuss them and get your initial thoughts before we talk more in depth about the 8 stages. What are the merits to Erikson's theory? Right? What have you noticed that children and people in general go through his 8 stages? When I was reading this, his theory seemed sort of fatalistic. We could not escape from each stage, and if we were messed up at one stage, it has negative consequences down the road. So I had the question, is it possible for a person to overcome stunted development at any of the stages and not be super negatively affected down the road? Also, A key question to think about is, do people develop at different rates? Right? Do the age limits prescribed by Erikson, do they occur for every person, or do they depend upon individuals and upon cultures? All right. So stage one, that is the conflict between basic trust versus mistrust. Right? It is the stage from birth to about 2 years old. Right? The key foundational teacher for this development stage is the child's mother. Right? Being raised in an environment of fear leads to mistrust down the road. It does not allow for the child to trust authority figures. Right? Whereas being raised in a loving environment allows children to build trust between themselves and with others. Right? So if you would like to pause again, this is especially relevant to teachers, I think, because we do see a lot of children who seem to have trust issues. And so I ask the question, if a student was raised in an environment of fear and they have that sense of mistrust ingrained in them, can they learn to trust after this initial period? Right? Stage two is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Right? Children tend to experience this from 2 to 4 years old, and both parents help shape the child at this level, both the mother and the father. Right? So you should encourage your child to discover. It leads to self-confidence, it leads to self-realization, it leads to an autonomous child. Both parents should positively encourage a child to explore him or herself, right? Then they will have more autonomy as they grow older. Negative reinforcement, for example, telling a child no in harsh language, leads to feelings of shame and self-doubt, and the child loses confidence both in themselves now and down the road. Right. Stage 3 is initiative versus guilt. Right? So ages 4 to 5 years is the period that a child is shaped with this conflict. Children are shaped primarily by their extended family, but this is the first stage in which teachers also start to shape the child's development. A lot of children are in kindergarten or preschool, and so they start to be influenced by an adult who is not their parents. So children should be encouraged to try new things and develop their own interests. Preschool teachers should allow for children to explore and to try new things. And negative reinforcement leads to guilt about their desires and interests. So children should be constantly encouraged to try new things so that they can figure out what they like. Right? So a key question is, how can preschool and kindergarten teachers help children develop initiative? Right? What activities could you think of in terms of lesson planning to sort of help guide children to showing initiative and to figuring out what their interests are? And if you want to pause for a second, you can discuss that with a partner. Right. Stage 4 is industry versus inferiority. Right? Children are shaped in this stage from ages 5 to 12, and they are shaped primarily by teachers and by neighbors. Right? Children at this stage want to prove that they can do things right. Right? They seek recognition from teachers and peers that they have completed tasks correctly. Right? So recognition of doing these tasks correctly instills a virtue of hard work, but recognition when they have done things incorrectly, but not jumping down their throats and yelling at them also instills the virtue of hard work. Allow them to learn from their mistakes. Right? Negative reinforcement leads to a feeling of inferiority and a loss of motivation. And as a middle school teacher, I have noticed this particularly, but I even notice it with high schoolers as well. When you tell a student they have done something wrong, they tend to shut off. Right? And so, as teachers, how do you balance the need to positively reinforce a child, but also let them know when they have made a mistake? So, what are some techniques to use in the classroom to do that? Because it is a very important balance. And if you want to pause again and take a couple of minutes to discuss it or write your thoughts down, that would be wonderful. Right, stage 5, which is primarily the teenage years, is the conflict between identity versus role confusion. Right, as many people notice with teenagers, they are shaped by their peer group, but they're also shaped by role models, which teachers need to be. They need to be positive role models at that stage of development. The peer group, teenagers want to fit in. Teenagers tend to feel that they have many roles in society. They feel like they are student, child, but also a peer to their friends, and they start feeling like they are a citizen. I've noticed a lot of teenagers becoming more and more politically active, especially as they move on in teenagerdom, because they have to sort of come to grips with the fact that they're going to join the real world, so to speak. And individuals should be allowed to explore their identities, right? Sort of figure out who they are. They should find themselves, right? So, again, allowing them to learn from their mistakes. We should give them correction when we feel that they have erred, but we do need to allow them to make mistakes. Because forcing a teenager to conform leads to sort of a confusion of their role in society, and they become unsure of themselves, which leads to stunted growth later in life. So, key question for stage 5: how do we as teachers allow students to express their own individuality while simultaneously preparing them to conform to some of society's standards and norms? As teachers, we have to prepare students for the real world, right? And society does have standards that we have to conform to. But how do we balance that with allowing students to express their individuality? Right? Stage 6, this is has less teacher involvement. The last teacher involvement was really in stage 5. Intimacy versus isolation. People experience this stage of development from ages 20 to 40. Right? They seek to find intimate connections with others. And here is sort of where I question this stage of development, because I've noticed teenagers too, they seek to find intimate connections with others. They tend to let go of relationships that we formed to just fit in quotes. Right? And we seek to find long-term commitment, whether to an individual or a significant other or to a group of friends. Right? Finding it leads to confidence and happiness, whereas failure to find it leads to isolation and loneliness. Here is another instance where I disagree with some sort of the age range. Teenagers, when they fail to find a peer group, also tend to feel greater isolation and loneliness. And even children do too when they're ignored by their peers. There is this isolation and loneliness. So here I'm disagreeing a little bit with the primary crisis. Okay, before we go into the next stage, I do want to give you guys a vocab term that is generativity, which is the concern for people besides oneself and one's family, and the feeling of need to nurture and guide a younger generation. And this primary conflict in stage 7, generativity, which I just discussed, versus stagnation. Right? And here again, I'm going to disagree a little bit with the age range of 40 to 65. Generally, people are influenced by family and peers at work, and people consider how they contribute to society. And again, I'm not in this age range yet, but I still find the need to consider how I contribute to society, and I think most teachers do. So here I have a little bit of a problem with the age range sort of prescribed by Erikson's thought. Right. There's a desire to pass knowledge on to the next generation, and there's the feeling of stagnation when we are not able to do this successfully leads to more isolation and general pessimism. Think of middle-aged people complaining about kids these days. Okay? And so a question I'm going to pose, and that you can pause the video and discuss or write down your thoughts, is it possible for people to feel this conflict before ages prescribed by Erikson? As I said before, I have felt the need to pass down knowledge to the next generation and how I contribute to society, and I am not yet 40. Okay, before we move into the final stage, there's one more vocab term, and that is ego integrity, which is a non-narcissistic love of the self. So you're not obsessed with your looks or how you appear to your peer group, but you do have a love of the self. This love of the self conveys world order or a spiritual sense, and it gives off a sense of wisdom. Okay. So stage 8 is that ego integrity that I talked about versus despair. Right? And the age of that development is generally 65 years old until we die. Right? And at that age, people generally retire, people have more time to think, and that people generally reflect more about their life. Right? Overall positive reflection leads to general feeling of contentment, whereas negative reflection leads to general feeling of bitterness at the world. The best example I can think of is the cranky old man who yells at people to get off their front lawn. Okay, and back to the key questions, since we have discussed the various stages, is what are the merits of Erikson's theory? Right? Do you think this breaking down of life into distinct stages and distinct conflicts has merit, and why or why not? Right? Again, his theory suggests that each block is necessary for the next block, which I found is rather fatalistic, and so I asked, is it possible for a person to overcome a stunted development stage at any stage and still live a healthy, productive life? And do people develop at different rates? Okay, that is it, and thank you very much for listening.